Okay, how are we doing? We got one person, that's good. Hey Tina, how's it going? Can you hear me just fine? Any issues? Just want to double check since never know. But yeah, well, good afternoon. Good to see everyone who's here, or at least see the people that have shown up. And I hope that we can have a productive chat today about the issues associated with fear, loneliness, and successes actually in coping with the pandemic and, kind of moving on and creating a more structured life after this huge change and transition for all of us. So, you know, I'd love to chat and kind of talk about some things. I have some thoughts on loneliness and some thoughts on fear. So let's just kind of jump right in. And Tina says there's no issues here with me, which is good. So let's go with that for the time being. So here's one of the issues that I find is pretty common in our pandemic/quarantine life is loneliness. But before I do that, let me go change something real quick. It's kind of noisy. So here's the thought. Something like this. We kind of are facing a loneliness epidemic, or at least that's the way it's being described by a lot of people. And I think it's important to talk that out from the point of view of the data and from the point of view of everyone's kind of lived experience here. And what I've noticed is that most people seem to be doing okay from what I can tell online and from what I can tell in most of my conversations. I don't hear too many people reporting that they feel lonely. And that's probably a good sign, but again, there's always the issue of sampling bias and things like that. So starting with just that premise, let's talk out the idea that maybe there is a loneliness epidemic and maybe there is a problem with, managing our sense of felt connection, because I would say that people misunderstand the concept of loneliness more so. I mean, everyone kind of knows what it's like, right? Where you're kind of around people or near people, but you don't really feel like you're connecting with them. And the lack of connection is disconcerting, right? So that feeling, that felt sense of a lack of connection obviously sticks out to everyone and can be what we call loneliness. But I also think that it's more complicated than just, I don't feel like I'm connected right now. And I wrote an article for a blog. I wrote a blog for Psychology Today. Thank you to Dr. David Lay, who posted that. I'll put the link to that in the caption, talking about this issue. And here's what sticks out to me, is that there are lots of studies that are kind of epidemiological in nature. They're overviews, they're reviews. And these studies seem to really focus on the felt sense of loneliness. And they seem to focus on kind of standardized measures like the UCLA loneliness scale. And a lot of it is kind of just extrapolating from small subpopulations. And a lot of the data seems to be focused on older people who feel lonely. There's actually fewer studies, to my knowledge, that focus on younger people, Generation Z, the millennials, and all that. I don't see much data on that seems reliable or what you can extrapolate from right now. So is it fair to say that there are more older people who are living alone? For sure. We have solid data on that. There's a study by, let me see if I can see it over here real quick, by Corton and Knapp, published back in 2015. And the study basically found that, yes, there is a kind of a widespread loneliness issue associated with older individuals because they're both living alone and they are feeling more isolated. But at the same time, there's a question about the validity of the concept of loneliness in the first place. And secondarily, is it the issue of just being socially isolated, or is it they actually feel isolated or they feel alone? So that's one of the things I want to tease out right now. And I would love to hear from anyone who's watching what they think about this and what they're experiencing personally, because I think your personal experiences are very, very important in terms of understanding what's going on with loneliness. So here's the issue for me. The issue for me is people seem to confuse being alone physically, being physically separate from, with loneliness. And in fact, if you look at a lot of the standardized measures that look at loneliness, there's less focus on a self-understanding of your needs for connection, things like that, and more focus on having enough time to be connected to people, so to speak, so physical proximity, etc. But that's not accounting for the quality of the relationship with people. That's one of the big issues. And I think if you actually take a slightly deeper look into what loneliness really is, and I did a video on this a long time ago, so you're welcome to go check that out. But if you do a kind of a deeper dive into the concept of loneliness, it has less to do with your physical proximity to people, and it has more to do with your kind of your standard understanding of your needs for connection, and then how efficiently you get them met. So in the article that or the blog post that I published for Dr. David Lay, it showed that it's very, very difficult for people to understand their needs for connection. And people don't seem to understand the simplest of things, like what's the difference between, let's say, perceiving that someone's there and they're paying attention versus feeling as if you matter when they're paying attention to you, right? Because there's a world of difference, I would assume, for most people, between we're talking versus we're talking, and I really do feel like you get what I'm saying. You're not just parroting back something I said. There's a pretty strong sense of we're really in this moment together. There's a vibe, if you want to use a non-scientific way of looking at it, right? So we actually feel like we're vibing, so to speak. So that felt sense of connection, that felt sense of presence, or what, popular therapy authors like Dan Siegel talk about as attunement, right? So if there's that felt sense of you're being connected with, then we tend to do better. We tend to feel less lonely. And this goes back to the old concept of you can be like at a party or something, and you can feel like you're all by yourself, even though there's 50 people standing nearby, right? So I think the issue for me, or one of the issues, is we tend to, let's say, mistake being separate from versus being actually lonely, right? And there is a pretty decent literature that kind of tries to split the two, but for the most part, it seems like the average person doesn't pay close attention to the dramatic difference between the two. We kind of get the two kind of overlapping or confused. So when it comes to loneliness now in the pandemic, I would kind of encourage you to think about not just, are you in physical proximity? Do you have consistency of contact with people? But also, what's the quality? What's the intensity of the contact? Because, it's impossible, I would say, just from the point of view of clinical psychology, from what I do when I do work with patients. If I'm sitting across from someone and I'm half here and half somewhere else, thinking about whatever they're saying to me, but also thinking about my grocery list, I'm not really present, and I'm not really catching the full emotional intensity of whatever's going on with the patient. And it's literally no different for our friends, our family members, our coworkers, etc. So what I would argue, even though there's not great epidemiological data that shows there's an actual loneliness epidemic, even though a bunch of people I know talk about it as if it's true, and I kind of said that in the blog post, but I want to clarify what I mean. I don't believe that there are 35 million people in the United States that have, just as a ballpark, that feel so desperately alone that they're depressed and confused and anxious. That's not what I believe. What I believe is that there's a pretty substantial majority of people that probably don't have that good quality emotional connection, intimate connection with the people that they're close by with, or even that they're in relationships with. Because think about it this way. Think about the people you care about the most. Think about all the great things about those people. Maybe it's a romantic partner, maybe it's a family member or a very good friend. Think about the conflict you have with this person, because the truth of the matter is there's no such thing as a perfect relationship, and there's no such thing as, even in some cases, a good relationship. A lot of the time what we have is a highly conflictual relationship where we perceive the negative emotional experiences and the conflict as bad, even though I would argue that they're part of normal kind of operating parameters in most relationships. So most people have some version of reservations. Maybe that's because of childhood stuff or attachment stuff or trauma. Maybe it's because of just how you were raised culturally. And the person you're sitting across from comes from a very different background and orientation about how to relate. Maybe you're very introverted and they're very extroverted, and their kind of energy is overwhelming the person. Again, not a very scientific concept, but just as an example of why we might feel disconnected, even among the people that we're closest to or we care the most about. Maybe you have like different layers of dynamics that get in the way of connecting fully. So let's just say that it's friends, right? Maybe you and a friend of yours are attracted to each other, or there's one directional attraction. That will get in the way, in a reasonable way, of feeling fully close, because there's probably an unspoken conflict. Most people are very afraid of their sexual desires and needs, and we kind of live in a very puritanical society that says, you shouldn't articulate what you feel and how you feel about people intimately and sexually. So there's a lot of that shame around, intimate attraction to people, even if they're not potential romantic partners. So there's a variety of dynamics and reasons, and that was just an example. I'm not saying it's everyone or common, just as an example. It's perfectly common for people to have conflicts that keep them from feeling perfectly close or intimate or really fully present and attuned with each other. So my argument would be is that we're not in a loneliness epidemic per se, in the sense that there's a bunch of people who just feel like they're terribly connected, or their friends don't really care, or their family doesn't really care. I don't think it's that stark or that black and white. What I would argue is that there's this kind of maybe it's a bimodal distribution, or maybe it's like the bell curve. I don't know. I don't have a good enough grasp of the data yet. But what I would argue is that there's probably a fair number of people who have what you could call suboptimal connection with the people they care about. And I think that for a long time, as I argued in the blog I did for Psychology Today, I think for a long time we've unconsciously and not very thoughtfully been distracting ourselves and devaluing our connections. And let me play out this thesis a little bit so that you don't have to actually read the article if you don't want to. Get some water. And Nazbolian Bolshapart says, hello. I'm a little late. Well, welcome, Nazbolian. I don't know what you're going for there. It seems like a Napoleon reference, and that's hilarious. So cool. Glad you're here. So let's talk about this issue of loneliness. And please ask questions whenever you want. No big deal. I'll stop and come back and we can chat, and we can make it more of a dialogue if you want. So let's talk about this idea of loneliness. So my thesis is not that we're in a loneliness epidemic like a lot of the news articles say. I think I saw a Vox article that said that, especially about the pandemic. I don't think it's as black and white as that. I don't think it's that people are physically disconnected or they just aren't talking to their friends as much. I don't think that's the problem. I think the quality of the relationships have been lessening over time. And here's my theory, and you tell me if it makes sense. So here's my argument. First part, there's three parts. The first part is, it seems like a lot of people spend a pretty significant amount of time on social media. They spend a pretty significant amount of time in hobbies and other things of that nature. They spend a pretty significant amount of time consuming mind-altering substances, alcohol, cannabis, tobacco, etc., etc. And they spend a pretty significant amount of time maybe playing video games or things of that nature. So I'd say there's a variety of distractions or escapes. And the word you could use, not to be too pathologizing, is escapism. So I would say that we have a kind of escapist mentality here in the United States specifically. I can't speak to other cultures very well because I don't live there. I don't have the same lived experience. I wasn't acculturated in other worlds. So my deal is definitely only US focused at this time. So from what I can tell, we seem to have a fairly consumerist society, which has pros and cons, and we seem to have a fairly escapist society. We're like the number one user of prescription psychotropic meds, and we're the number one consumer of most illegal drugs and legal drugs, to the best of my recollection. And if I'm wrong about that data, please confront me and I'll gladly change my opinion, but I believe that's the truth. I believe that's an accurate fact or statement. So if we're the number one consumer of prescription medications for mental health and the number one consumer of illegal illicit drugs, and we spend inordinate amounts of time, between 5 and 6 hours a day, on social media or Netflix, etc., that's a lot. That's a lot. That's a giant chunk of time. And that number of that period of time, the amount of time spent per day, has actually increased consistently, to the best of my recollection. I mean, I linked it in my blog. We spend just an egregious amount of time online, either social media or consuming videos like this. So I'm not helping the problem. There's a variety of things that we do to consume media, to get information, to deal with, curiosity, and to cope. So there's a variety of different, let's say, escapist things that we're doing. And my proposition is that if you look at the rates of television watching, the rates of internet use, the rates of social media consumption, it seems like they're all pretty consistently increasing over time. So my argument is that basically most people are engaging in escapism on a pretty regular basis. Not that everyone is. In fact, I'd be willing to bet that different age groups manage escapism differently. I'd be willing to bet that older generations, the boomers and the Xers, probably deal with it differently than maybe the Generation Z people or the millennials do. So I would argue that we have a kind of a subculture by subculture escapism a change in the amount of time. Now, there's a cool article that just came out today, and let me see if I can pull it up real quick so that I can be very kind of, I can be very specific about the author, because it was a great article. It's on Twitter. Check my profile. Sorry, just one second. I should have had this pulled up and ready to go. Okay, so Amy Orben, her name is Amy Orben, O-R-B-E-N. She just put out an article. She posted it on Twitter, and her Twitter handle is @OrbenAmy. And it's called The Sisyphean Cycle of Technology Panics. And it's a phenomenal article. I highly recommend anyone who's interested in like smartphone addiction or internet addiction or social media addiction to check it out. Because the truth of the matter is people have been panicking about smartphones and radio and television as they've come on the scene. So she points out all the different research studies that were done on like radio addiction and things like that happened back in the 40s. And the truth of the matter is everyone's always panicked about that. So I want to be perfectly clear, just using her article for contrast, that that's not my argument. My argument is not that we are addicted to our phones or that we're addicted to our social media or that we're addicted to television or Netflix binging, etc. Right? And I'll explain my rationale for that. But before I explain my rationale for that, let me go over here and take a look at the questions. So Nazbolian says, yes, my name is a pun for Russian Napoleon Bonaparte, da 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 da. And the Bolshevik is a play on the Bolsheviks and Bonaparte. Cool. Hilarious. Love it. And Catboy Romeo says, I don't think our media consumption does lead to a certain increase in paranoia. I do think, he said, I do think our media consumption does lead to a certain increase in paranoia. And I'm sure you're aware of mean world syndrome. So I've never heard of mean world syndrome. I'm happy to look that up. You can also educate me if you want. But yeah, I would say that increased access to disconcerting information will lead us to kind of more hysteria in some ways, like mass hysteria. But that's a separate talk for a separate day. In fact, I wonder if you all think it would be useful if I did a talk on mass hysteria in the media, because it seems like it's been tossed around by journalists and people online for the last couple of weeks during the pandemic. So maybe that would be a good topic. What do you think? Let me know. So getting back to the thesis. So there's three parts. The first part is I'm pulling from all the data from like Statista and other websites that shows that basically media consumption has gone up consistently over time since the birth of the internet back in the early 90s, essentially, and popularizing it. It's gone up and up and up and up and up. And since we've gotten more, let's say, evolved, advanced technology, faster moving, data tracking, etc., all this stuff on our phones, our smartphones, it's become so much easier to consume lots and lots of information, which is both great and bad for us. And I'm going to put out a book here in probably another year, or hopefully sooner, called The Mind Diet, to talk about that problem. But separate from that, or kind of leg number one of my three-legged stool is we're consuming more and more media, and we're doing more and more things to escape, whether it's through sports, whether it's through television, Netflix, Hulu, social media, whatever it is, which just is a statement of fact, not a statement of good, bad, or otherwise. So we're engaging in escapism more. Second leg to my argument is something like, if you think about, let's say, just a given day, right? In a given day, there's 24 hours, right? And you're supposed to sleep for roughly 8 of them, which probably many people don't, but we're supposed to. And then you have 5 to 6 hours a day on your phone. And then supposedly you're working between 4 and 8 hours a day, right? So between sleeping for 8 hours, that's 8. Working for, let's say, 8 hours, that's, 16. And then you're consuming 5 to 6 hours of media per day, right? So let's low end it. Let's call it 5, right? So that's 21. So now you have 3 hours left to eat, exercise, and spend quality time connecting with people. Is that really enough for the average person? I highly doubt it. I really doubt it. Now, it's not to say that you can't connect with people over social media. I've formed very interesting connections thanks to social media, especially Twitter. And they're cool people. A lot of them are researchers and just people that I find fascinating from all over the world. So I'm very grateful for social media. I'm not trying to bash it. I think it's being overused, but I don't think it's bad inherently. So my argument is that we are, let's say, making trade-offs. We're making short-term deals, short-term trade-offs where we're choosing to spend pretty significant amounts of time Netflixing or watching Hulu or on social media, having, let's say, less than optimal connection. Because you can still have decent connection, but it's not optimal. Because optimal is right here, where we can see each other, we can smell each other, we can even kind of quote unquote feel the vibe with each other. That is what's ideal for most people. And given that, I'd say people are spending a lot of time, or a fair amount of time at least, doing these things. We've spent less time over the last 2 decades focusing on building and maintaining more deep quality relationships with each other. So premise number one, we're spending a fair amount of time, maybe too much, on social media, binging Netflix, Hulu, and having, let's say, suboptimal connection. Stool leg number 2 is that the unintended consequence that we don't see, it's insidious. It's a behavior that has unintended consequences that we don't pay attention to. So because time is limited, right? It's finite. If you only have so much time and you're spending so much time working or sleeping or something else or on social media, you have less time to actually physically, in person, feel intimately connected with people. So then that brings you to leg of the stool number 3. As a result of this, we have kind of gradually taught ourselves to value very short, brief, intense emotional connection with people, intimate connection with people. But now that the pandemic has hit, we have less access to our distractions, going to the bar, going to sporting events, things of that nature. And then B, we have less access to actual people. So because we've kind of, let's say, put ourselves in a deficit state of mind with regard to relationships, and we've kind of, let's say, undervalued people overall as a whole, then there's a deficit in our brain of feeling connected, feeling important, feeling as if we matter. And that's because we just haven't been spending enough time investing in the felt presence, the felt connection, the vibe, as it were. So, because the pandemic hit, we not only lost our distractions, but we lost our easy, instant access to people when we do finally notice that we're feeling lonely. Now that we have less access to people, we're probably feeling lonely more, would be my guess. Or some people are. There's probably subpopulations of people that are. Maybe people with mental health conditions are struggling more. Maybe people with substance use disorders. Maybe people who are homeless. Maybe people who are more introverted by nature or extroverted. I don't know. There's no data on this that I'm aware of, but it's easy to kind of postulate that maybe certain groups of people are struggling with this kind of unexpected loneliness, this unexpected void, because they were so successful at distracting beforehand, so successful in getting, let's say, mediocre or slightly better than mediocre connection through Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, and now TikTok. So that's my 3-part stool. Increased time distracting, escapism, whatever you want to call it, not addictive. I'll have a whole talk on process addictions. I'm going to post that probably this weekend. So I'm not saying it's an addiction. I'm just saying that it's a habit that we enjoy and has some benefit, but it also is being overused, because there's such a thing as too much of a good thing, right? So it's being overused is leg of the stool 1. The second leg is we're unintentionally spending less time nurturing quality relationships and building depth and breadth in our relationships. So there's less of a foundation for the relationships that we need. So because of that, now we get to leg 3. When this pandemic hit, all of a sudden there's people who don't really have that same felt presence because they've been not investing as much, right? Investing their time and energy as much. So that's my theory about loneliness. I don't know if it makes sense to anyone, but I'd love to hear about it from you. Catboy Romeo, coming back to the subject of mean world syndrome, says, mean world syndrome is that because we have gotten better at reporting gruesome events from around the world, this leads people to think that the world is becoming much more violent than it actually is. I think I argued something similar in my book, The Fear Problem, right up there, that basically it's not that the world's worse or better. It's just that we now have increased access to all the horrible things we didn't used to see as much. We had very few TV channels once upon a time, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and now we have tons of TV channels. We had very few radio stations. Now we have hundreds of thousands of them. We had very few media outlets. Now we have dozens of them. New tech companies form all the time. So yeah, increased access means increased overwhelm, which is something I'll talk about in my book called The Mind Diet, coming out soon. And Catboy also says, because we've just gotten quicker at digesting multiple events, and it's become more readily available. Yeah, right, exactly. We're overwhelming ourselves. That's my argument. That's the argument that's going to come in my book, my upcoming book. We're just overwhelming ourselves. Many people are. Some people aren't, but many people are. So it's an issue, and we need to deal with it. So my proposition is, because of the fear associated with the coronavirus and the pandemic and quarantine life, loss of jobs, which is a real serious problem, loss of family members, which is a real serious problem, loved ones, it's very sad. We're having a hard time coping with that. I'd say, kind of back to a previous video I did, a lot of people are grieving, for sure. But at the same time, a lot of people are also lonely, and it's unexpected, and they don't quite know how to parse it or make sense of it. And I think, let me offer just one simple definition of loneliness, and then we can talk about how to cope with it. And I'd love to hear from everyone in the last half hour of this, what they're doing that's effective for coping. I want to hear your successes. If you've got a couple of wins in the last couple of weeks, I'd love to hear about them. Even if it's something simple, like, I went on a walk and it felt good. So here's my theory of loneliness. Loneliness is 2 parts. Loneliness is first and foremost a deficit of felt connection, of attunement, of intimacy, of feeling as if you are with someone. And that deficit can come about for a variety of reasons, which leads me to part two. The other reason that loneliness shows up for people, in my opinion, my clinical opinion, based upon my work with people, etc., is we often don't know what our needs are. People often live in this state of autopilot where they're kind of used to certain habits and they do those habits, and they do them not very thoughtfully. They're not, let's say, mindfully present or emotionally present in their lives, in their bodies, etc., etc. So what I would argue is that many people are not aware of what they actually need. Many people are not paying attention to their body and to their mind and to their feelings. They're not paying attention to the, let's say, the internal intrinsic cues about whether or not things are going well. And then they're becoming upset and feeling lonely and disconnected all of a sudden, right? In my mind, all of a sudden should never happen when it comes to these simple social interactions, because if we really are paying attention to what we need to the best of our ability, we can catch a problem. We can manage and notice an issue in felt connection or not. So my proposition is this: loneliness is a lack, a deficit of felt importance or connection or presence or attunement, whatever word you like. And it's also an ignorance of one's needs around connection, intimacy, and importance. Because if you're doing something and you're not getting the response that you're expecting from the world, obviously expectations can lead to resentment and all sorts of problems, but there is a very reasonable expectation that most people have that if we're really trying to connect, that there should be some reciprocity. We're evolutionarily built, I guess you could say, to cooperate and have reciprocity. And when we don't have it, we tend to get pissed off and feel bad. It often leads to shame and guilt and confusion and low self-esteem and things of that nature. So that's my kind of my two-part discussion of, or my two-part definition of loneliness. So how do we cope with it? It's a good question. Before we talk about coping, let's go back over here. So in the chat, I see that Catboy Romeo says, a good example of this is school shootings. Total gun deaths actually fall each year, as well as the peak of total school shootings was actually in 2015. But big events like Stoneman Douglas leads people to think that they're on the rise. Well, I'm not very up on the data regarding school shootings, so I'm not going to make a statement on it. My hope is that you're right and that they're on the decline. That's my hope. I'm sure there's all sorts of data that I don't know anything about and opinions that I've never heard. So I hope you're right, is my statement. I hope it's on the decline. Nature Spirit says, hi, Dr. Patrick. Nice to catch you. I've been doing indoor gardening, hands in the dirt, grounding with nature. Thanks for all you are putting out there for everyone. Absolutely. And I'm happy to do this. I just want to be of help to people. So, please share and like and subscribe and all that so I can just help as many people as possible. Going back to what you're actually doing, Nature Spirit, that's awesome that you're getting out and not getting out, but you're doing gardening, because I think, there's some low quality research. It's not high quality, but there's some low quality research that says, being outside is good for you, or being in nature or dealing with nature or having plants is good for you. So, it's worth thinking about, even though there's no clear, kind of empirical literature that shows that playing with plants is going to cure your depression. That's not true. That'll never be true. But, there's definitely something valuable about growing something, nurturing something, like with plants. We're designed to play by nature. So sometimes playing in the dirt, digging in the dirt, creating, crafting life is fun, for sure. So I'm glad you're doing that. Gardening is fun. If you have the financial means to do so, it's a great idea. Grow some plants or some tomatoes or something. Go for it. Catboy Romeo says, I'm not a good person to ask about loneliness. I'm very introverted, and aside from a breakup, I've been coping well with the isolation. I'm sorry to hear about your breakup. I hope that everything's going okay there, and you're getting kind of the support you need around it from your friends and family. And just be careful getting back into relationships. Relationships are highly emotional and challenging circumstances. So they can be great if they're handled well and they're mutually agreed upon and constructed well. But if you're not dealing with relationships well, then the issue becomes um, conflict and chaos and affairs and all that stuff. So, I hope that you take the time after the breakup to kind of reassess what you need and how things are working and not working for you, and kind of do your best to take care of yourself. Um, Catboy Romeo says, though I have noticed strange non-social effects, like I've developed an irrational fear of thunder from not being out of the house for long. So you kind of have a sensitivity to thunder right now. Happens. I could see that. So, I hope you're okay. And if you need more support, feel free to let me know. Nature Spirit says, it's far too early in Vermont to plant until June 1st, so inside it is. Okay, so can't plant outside just yet. That's all right. Do your best, do your best. So on the topic of coping with isolation and loneliness, and again, just so we're perfectly clear, there's a dramatic difference between social isolation, being physically separate from someone, versus feeling like you're actually disconnected. Because I'll give you a quick, for instance, in my personal life. I have a couple of very good friends, and they're very close to me for a variety of like historical reasons, and we've been through some hell together, which is great and confusing as well. But we formed a pretty cool relationship as a result. And what I've noticed is that we don't have to be physically present very often to even feel very connected. Even in our phone calls and Skype calls in the last couple of weeks, we still feel fairly well connected. So, it's about the quality of the connection, less so about social isolation that leads to loneliness. So obviously, if you're extensively disconnected, right, socially isolated, there is a problem. I think one of the best counterexamples to my argument right now is probably people who are put in isolation in prison. Like they're put in the hole or whatever it's called. And that's horrible. I mean, to me, that seems like torture almost. And I don't know why it's still legal. But maybe it's for safety reasons. I don't know. But still, it just seems like torture to me from what I can tell. And obviously, there is an upper limit for all of us in terms of how much physical separation, social isolation we can experience. But the felt sense of disconnection is more of what loneliness really is. Tim says, as an older person who has recently moved, it seems harder to make connections than when I was younger. Yeah, for sure. I'm sure it's very difficult, and depending upon where you move to, maybe the culture is different, so that also makes it different or difficult as well. There's probably a variety of reasons as to why it's more difficult. So I'm not sure. I mean, I think I would need to know quite a bit about you to give more specific feedback, but generally speaking, I would say that finding people who are like-minded is probably the best choice. Hobbies, interests, religion, etc. So Tim says, I went from a rural area to a city. Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I went through this once upon a time. I was younger, obviously. So when I first moved out to California from where I went from a pretty small town of a few thousand people, maybe 10, 15,000 people, to Los Angeles, which is, 10 million people or something like that. So it was a big shock to me when I moved out here about 10 or 11 years ago. And it took me a long time to make kind of solid friendships because it's a huge city, lots of people to sift through, and kind of, sometimes happenstance allows you to find friends. Or if you're working, Tim, maybe that'd be a decent place to find a couple of friends or at least casual acquaintances. Or if you have a social group or a hobby that you partake in, maybe that would be a decent place to find friends. Or a religion. I often see, I'm not sure how you can do this now, but I've actually had a lot of patients have success with that Meetup platform, or I don't know if it's an app or if it's just a website, but Meetup seems to help a lot of my patients get back into a new routine. I've had a couple of patients join like dodgeball leagues or because they're kind of younger and they deal with like sports, they're kind of physical people. Sometimes something as stupid as a book club, or seemingly stupid as a book club, can be helpful. I know people still do that, strangely enough. There's a variety of ways to connect, but a number one issue for me was just time. There's only so much time, obviously, especially if we're older, but there's probably still time for you to make friends, and it might just take a minute. And the best thing we can do is just keep going out there and trying. It's all we can really do. And just do your best to be strategic about it so that it serves you. Catboy says, the majority of the time, it's a safety risk to not put prisoners in isolation. It would be much cheaper to not house them individually, so they would have done so already. Okay. And that makes sense. I don't really know the financials or any of that stuff, but I could see that. I mean, I think there's a giant conversation this country needs to have about prisons in the first place and all that, but that's a separate rant for a separate video or chat. But yeah, coping with loneliness is difficult. Making friends, remaking friends, reconnecting with old friends. There's so many paths we can take when it comes to managing loneliness and finding that felt sense of connection with people. And the number one thing for me, at least from the individual point of view, is always making sure you're perfectly clear on what your needs are. Because if you do the hard work, and I really do think it's hard, I think it's very difficult for people to kind of take a look inward at how they're built. So let's just use Catboy Romeo for an example. Catboy said that I'm an introvert. What was your exact phrasing so I don't mess it up? I'm very introverted. And aside from a breakup, I've been coping well with the isolation. Okay. So that's a great example of the kind of introspective work that you can do when you're thinking about what your real needs are for connection. Because on the one hand, it's easy to just kind of push it off or brush it off and say, well, I'm like everyone else. Everyone else just, naturally finds friends, or, when this quarantine ends, it'll be no big deal. But I think we actually have an opportunity right now to kind of do some self-reflective work, and in even kind of some of the simplest ways. What if you could just go on a walk when it's safe and start kind of ruminating, thinking about whatever your relationships have been like, and processing what's been successful and what's not been successful about your friendships or intimate relationships? Because we typically operate in patterns, we typically succeed in patterns, and we typically struggle interpersonally in patterns. Even though there's a lot of chaos and randomness in the universe, our behavior tends to follow patterns. And typically they're fairly rigid or obvious patterns if we just kind of do enough self-reflective work, which is why so many self-help psychologists, create journals and do all this book writing about how to, find yourself and all that. And that's nonsense. But you can do a lot of the work yourself if you're kind of in a decent headspace. If you're clinically struggling with depression or anxiety or psychosis or attachment issues, then please seek out counseling. But if you're kind of on the lower end of just kind of being a little neurotic or just struggling a little bit, maybe it's a good time to self-reflect now that we're in this quarantine life. You have kind of some free space to really kind of get into yourself and understand what you need. Sometimes we can figure out who we are through just the songs that we like, which might reflect more of a temporary state, but still, there are probably patterns there. There are probably a lot of hints that we overlook, that we don't understand, or that we don't take seriously about who we are and what we need. And my encouragement to people is just, if you are struggling with that felt sense of presence, if you are feeling lonely, you now have an opportunity, I think, to kind of use the space to self-reflect on what you might need and what your real needs are. Maybe back when you were working, and maybe you're working too much, like many people do in this country, you had a good distraction so that you could, let's say, settle for less intimate connection because you're already burnt out. Because it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to be intimate with people. It's a lot of work. One thing that I don't think most people understand about therapy and therapists in the first place is those of us who are not hacks, because there are plenty of hacks, but those of us who are not hacks are experiencing some mild to moderate intensity of emotional reciprocity when we work with patients. It's work to sit there and tolerate and understand and hold space for people's trauma and shame and confusion and guilt and hurt. It's not a simple thing. And this is not to make it about me or anything. It's just as an example, to actually really deal with people is very, very intense, especially if you're not built to kind of readily understand people, for sure. So the issue becomes, do you really know what you need? And do you know how you're built and what you can tolerate? Most people don't, from what I can tell. So if you really understand what you really need, then you're better able to manage and kind of come out the other side of this loneliness better, I would hope. This pandemic, this quarantine life, can be an opportunity for the people who are not dealing with obvious crises like, work or losing your job or losing family members. This is not to downplay anything that those people are going through. If you're dealing with a crisis or if you're grieving, then that's obviously the number one goal. But for the people who are not, then maybe this is an opportunity to kind of reassess, how much do I need to work? How much is the escapist mindset a part of my life? Because it is for all sorts of people, especially if they're, middle class, upper middle class, lower middle class. I would argue that a lot of people do escapist things. A lot of people use drugs. Again, I don't think drugs are bad. I think that people misuse them all the time. A lot of people do that with technology, with TV, and all sorts of things. So this is a good time to reassess, how much escapism do I do? Do I do some escapism by overworking? Do I do some escapism by over Twittering or whatever it is, Instagram, whatever, right? Are you problematically coping with stress, escapism? Because that's what it seems to be from all the literature on like smartphone addiction and internet addiction and all that. It seems like a problematic coping with stress. But that's a different discussion for a different day. I think I'll put that video out this weekend. So again, my hope is that for people, if they're struggling with loneliness, they can kind of do some self-evaluation, simple reflective work, whether it's they're going on a walk or journaling or whatever method you kind of relate to best. There's a way to get that information out. You might just need the right stimulus. Maybe it's a song or a movie or something physical. There's no real right or wrong way about it, in this non-clinical sense. So let me take a look over here. Catboy Romeo, back to the prisoner thing, says, it's probably not enough to separate prisoners by the severity of the crime, but we might need to divide them by the intent of the crime or the personality traits. I don't know. I mean, forensic psychology is not my thing, so I don't feel at all comfortable kind of, other than the broad statement that it seems like we put far too many mentally ill people in prison, which is a fact. It's a verified fact. Other than that, I don't feel comfortable talking about how to fix the criminal or justice system or the prison system. I mean, I think there's so many issues that I could never speak intelligibly about because it's not my background. It's not my job. It's not what I do for a living, etc. So I don't think it's fair for me to talk about it like that definitively, And Catboy Romeo says, I don't know if it would do anything. I don't know either. And Tim says, what is a good way to deal with escapism? That's a phenomenal question. Let me see if I can do that question justice by not rushing to answer it. So when it comes to escapism, my issue is, or my main concern is, what tolerance do you have already? Because I think one of the number one variables that's overlooked by people, and this is not from the research, this is just my opinion based upon my clinical work in the past. One of the biggest variables that I think people overlook when they're doing some kind of self-evaluation about these topics is, what's their tolerance already? What's your level of tolerance? Because we have tolerance for a variety of things. So like, we have tolerance for how much heat we can absorb or manage. We have tolerance for how much intimacy we can tolerate. We have tolerance for Just like we have tolerance for drugs and alcohol and food and things of that nature, we have tolerance for our emotional states too. So sometimes our window of tolerance is pretty small, but sometimes our window of tolerance is pretty good and we've just been distracting too much. So it's not to say that because you've been escaping a lot, you're going to have a low window of tolerance or a small window of tolerance. It's just to say that there's a chance you could have shrunk your window of tolerance for, let's say, emotional distress or fear, or anger, or sadness, or something of that nature. So the first thing I would encourage you to think about, Tim, is to kind of evaluate what your, let's say, window of tolerance is for stress in the first place. Because if you think it's pretty high, you think you can tolerate more, then the goal, in my opinion, needs to be more along the lines of kind of reminding yourself to not escape. And if you find that you don't have very good calluses, right? So, because you can't really see from the video, but I have some calluses on the palms of my hand here and on the tips of my fingers because I play the guitar. And I beat the crap out of my hands when I work out and mess around at home and stuff. So we build calluses, right, just physically from kind of repeated exposure to stress. And it's about how we cope with the stress that matters. So for me, if you find that you have not very good calluses for different types of stressors, your goal is to kind of gradually build calluses to those stressors, right? Not that you'll ever become calloused in that negative pejorative sense, but just that you build greater tolerance for the frustration. And again, the only way that we build tolerance to any of these frustrations is by slowly, gradually exposing yourself to a little bit more than you think you can tolerate. If you think about like Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, if you push yourself 10 to 20% outside of what you think you can tolerate, then maybe it'll get a little bit easier, right? So, if you can tolerate 10 minutes of silence, maybe you can push yourself to tolerate 11 minutes of silence. If you can tolerate 30 seconds of silence when you're sitting across from someone, maybe your goal is to tolerate 40 seconds of silence, which might seem like a lot. You know what I mean? So gradually pushing yourself is what helps. If you just go too far, push too hard, you tend to fall apart. It doesn't tend to work so well. So the first thing I'd recommend for anyone who's struggling with escapism is to really kind of self-assess, what's your actual tolerance for discomfort in the first place? Because if you have that negotiation with yourself, it actually gets easier to kind of make strategic decisions about how to, let's say, challenge yourself and grow and move forward. The second thing I would argue is that if you're escaping too much, see if you can do more to invest in the people that you already have, if you have kind of people you trust, and see if you can invest more in the, let's say, the skills that make you feel good and that allow you to, let's say, feel meaning in your life. Not to get too Jordan Peterson, but, the loneliness crisis could also be conceived of as a meaning crisis, but that's a different debate for a different chat. But yeah, see if you can invest more in what's meaningful. See if there's something meaningful that's a little bit stressful that's useful for you, whether it's like learning a language or reading a book that you think would be good for your mind, getting in touch with your spiritual side. Not that I'm a big fan of the concept of spirituality, but I would say that, there's a need for that for many people. So yeah, those are the kinds of things I would recommend, like, starting to think about. Catboy Romeo says, couldn't it be said that escapism might be an avoidance of dealing with a certain problem and thus putting it off by distracting themselves? Well, of course. We all escape. We all distract. Like, I'll give you a quick for instance. Let's just pretend, for the sake of argument right now, I'm sitting across from one of my friends and something's happening in the conversation and I look over here. Now, if I'm looking over there, there's a chance that me looking over there is a sign that I'm experiencing something uncomfortable or that I'm distracted, right? So we all kind of escape in little moments back and forth when we're in front of each other. And so, even nowadays, people kind of escape by even like looking at their phones while they're at the dinner table or whatever, which I think is a problem. But generally speaking, I would say that the need to distract yourself is not bad. It's about the degree of distraction that's the problem. Because we're not expected. I would argue, as kind of a clinical psychologist and as just a regular person, that I don't think we're well designed to just handle all the emotions that happen to us all at once all the time. I think that we're often overloaded. Now, especially if you're constantly looking at Facebook or Twitter or whatever, you probably are overwhelmed a lot more than you need to be. But I'd say even in regular conversation, because we're human, because we're imperfect, because we can't readily grasp how safe the person is across from us and stuff like that, I would argue that it's pretty okay. It's pretty normal to want to distract yourself. The issue for me is going to be, how much are you distracting? How frequently? How intensely? Right? And is it actually serving you and allowing you to have, let's say, appropriate breaks in intense circumstances? Or is it allowing you to not build calluses? Because if it's keeping you from building appropriate calluses, then that's a problem, right? So if you're outside of your window of tolerance and you're shrinking your window of tolerance by escaping or distracting, that's a problem. But if you're appropriately escaping, that would be kind of the better choice, I'd say. Kind of escaping in such a way that it doesn't interfere with your ability to grow or to handle things that are uncomfortable, right? Now, that's not to say that there's certain like things that you should be able to handle. Like if you're being assaulted, I would say that you're not supposed to handle that. I'd say that that's something that's supposed to be very uncomfortable and not well tolerated, right? Those kind of like traumas, not something we're supposed to be able to tolerate. So the issue for me is it's about the quality and intensity of escapism, not the fact that we're escaping in the first place. I just think people are doing it too much, right? And I think you'll know if you're doing it too much by a self-assessment of like how hard it is for you to connect with people, how hard it is for you to do meaningful things and feel like you have meaning in your life. I think the more you escape, the less meaning you feel. And there's a kind of a Goldilocks and the three bears, like just right amount for every person in their unique culture and values and beliefs, which I can't definitively define, and I don't think it'd be wise to try. Tim says that sounds like me. Yeah, and thanks. For sure. Happy to help. Tina says, I'd like to hear you play the guitar. Not today. Not today. I'm not nearly good enough. All right. So I see there is still a fair number of you online. And I don't think I've heard from all of you. I'd love to hear from all of you before I go. I needed to be wrapping this up soon. But yeah, loneliness, fear, escapism, coping. What are your successes in coping? I want to hear about them. So for those of you who are commenting, what are your successes in coping? What's working well for you right now? And then what's not working well, right? Because if you think about what's working well and what's not working well, you have the ability to kind of reflect and move on. And most of the time we're just stuck on autopilot. So I want to know what's working well for you. And while you all are commenting, I'll tell you what's working well for me. So far in this pandemic quarantine life, the things that have worked well for me include, I'd say exercising is working well for me as a coping skill. And I would say, and that's one of the reasons I'm so warm, is I actually went for a run before this and I'm still kind of warm from that. I would say that music is helping me cope right now. I would say that reading is helping me cope. I'd say that the work that I'm still able to do is helping me cope. I'd say that probably the biggest resource for me is the people in my life. I have a number of very important people who are helping me cope and kind of being supportive of, my journey right now. And my hope for everyone is that they have support, that they can find the right relationships that are not just like present and reasonable, but also nurturing and encouraging. Not that they should be one-dimensional and always nurturing and always encouraging, just that you have people who care. So my hope for you is that you find those people and that you can kind of develop them. So that's what's working for me right now. I don't know what's working for the rest of you. I'd love to hear about your successes before I go, if anyone wants to say things. Catboy says, what works for me is pets. And then starting a new project of some kind, like I got into beekeeping, and then reading and probably fictional escapism like games and such. Okay, so those sound good, I think what's important for us is we also need some kind of diversity. I mean, everyone's probably different, but I would assume that if you have multiple things that you can do to cope, it goes better, right? And then Catboy says, what doesn't work for me is watching things or being reminded of the social isolation. Right on. That makes sense to me, for sure. For sure. Well, I'm going to wait around for just another comment or two, and then I'll get off here and get back to my life, and you can get back to your routine or whatever you're doing. Catboy says, mostly because I stress about the amount of time, about the amount of time that has passed. Yeah, I mean, people are afraid. It's been, 30 days, 40 days, 50 days, 60 days. It's been a long time, and that's hard to grasp that we've lost like almost 2 months of our life, right? Tina says, darn, sorry. Just got to get going. And Colby says, and what I could have missed out on if it weren't for the virus. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people that are missing out on a lot of important things. I have so many people in my life who had like gigs coming up and concerts and conferences and stuff like that, no longer could do them because of the virus. It's hard. It's very hard. Tim says, you have so many videos. Can you suggest some on the same subject? Okay, cool. So regarding the topic of loneliness, I have a video that's, I think, titled Loneliness and Wellness. I also have a video that's titled Friendships and Wellness. And I think I also have a video titled Faces. So the loneliness video, the friendships video, and the faces video are probably great for managing loneliness, or videos to think about and watch for managing loneliness. With regard to fear, you can watch my Theory of Everything video, which is more tongue-in-cheek than serious. And you can watch my Weird Therapies video if you want, and you can watch my mindfulness video if you want. That should help you kind of at least have some kind of stab at understanding how those things might or might not be helpful. And then Saren goes, there he goes again, thinking we have lives. Yeah, of course you have lives. We all have lives. They may not be like rich and plentiful lives right now because of the virus and the pandemic and job loss and things like that. But we have lives. We all have lives. They're just not what we want. So we've got to work on it. Life is hard, requires lots and lots of work on all of our parts. Tim says, thanks, no problem, happy to help, whatever I can do. Please like and share everything that you find helpful. If it's not helpful, don't recommend it. Catboy says, the fact that a friend of mine won't have an in-person graduation this May also is difficult. It might be giving him xenophobia as the date approaches. I don't know what xenophobia is. There's so many phobias that I've never heard anything about. I wonder what that is. Frank Schmecker says, I just found this stream. Thank you. I find myself playing mindless games like bubble shooters and crosswords, etc. In my case, it's more of a numbing strategy. There's nothing wrong with wanting to numb. Just to reiterate, the problem is always going to be how much you numb and how often you numb. That's the issue. And if you're doing it so much that you can't carry out the standard meaningful things that we all need, like intimacy and friendship and play and humor and productive time and all that stuff, and that's the issue. If you can and you're checking out, cool. So long as there's plenty of meaning in your life, and so long as there's plenty of, let's say, connection, and you're having every kind of opportunity to succeed at the things that you love to succeed at, that's what really matters to me. Oh, xenophobia is an anti-Chinese sentiment. Oh, yeah, that's understandable. I mean, there's a lot of people who are very afraid and angry about China right now, and that's understandable given the circumstances. And I think that, we just need to do our best to manage our fear and our anger better. That's all. Catboy says, I'm imagining that might go up as the virus progresses. Maybe so. Yeah. Well, this has been interesting. It's been fun. I'm glad so many of you came out. Thank you for watching and sharing and expressing what you're going through and what you're experiencing. My hope is that we can get more and more people here chatting so that we can kind of have an even better dialogue, because I would prefer this to be more of a dialogue and less like a didactic lecture or something of that nature. You know what I mean? So please share as widely as possible, like and subscribe, all that good stuff. And I hope you have a good rest of your day. And I'll try and do this again next week. I'm not sure what day, but hopefully midweek. So you kind of have some kind of relief midweek. Okay. And then Catboy Romeo says, it's been a nice chat. Have a good evening. You too. And I hope the rest of you have a good rest of your day. Talk to you next week. Bye.